Probably I'll get started since it's 3 o'clock. Thanks all for attending this session. I was to present this session with Oliver Alter, who's my partner in crime on this topic. Unfortunately, Oliver had some personal emergency, so he sends his apologies. So I'll be walking through this presentation. Just for the introduction, my role is within PwC. I'm a chief technologist for the global data and analytics practice. And what that means is we have three lines of business: tax, consulting, and advisory. And I've worked with a lot of senior partners within these three lines to really understand what capabilities do they need in their lines of business, and then enable emerging technologies which can really bring those capabilities to light. I also have a global role, which is quite interesting because I also get to interact with a lot of folks outside of US, and it's really interesting to see a lot of innovation happening even outside the US. So I have that internal firm perspective. I also work with a lot of external clients across sectors to help with, to work with some of the senior leaders to figure out how they can really modernize some of these data platforms and how the journey really looks for them. In terms of today's presentation, I think we have had great presentations in the last 2 days where we had a lot of technical deep dives talking about some of the innovations in the space. But I'm going to focus on the enterprise space, right? What does it really mean for the enterprise? I think in a way there are a lot of great things happening in this space, but at the same time there are some real adoption barriers of Hadoop being deployed as an enterprise platform. And we kind of talk to both sides of the house when we talk to the clients, the business leaders, the technology leaders. So I'm going to talk about some of the trends which we see, some of the challenges which we see in the space, and what are the real opportunities to take those challenges and turn them as opportunities. And then we have a framework put in place, and I normally call these framework as being bilingual. It kind of really, I would say, relates to both sides of the house, both the business and technology stakeholders, because at the end of the day, this platform needs to scale and it needs to provide value. And most of our clients talk about value on day 2 when we get them started on this journey. And then I'll close it with a couple of real life use cases. And the reason that I picked these 2 use cases is because of the fact that we had 2 customers who were not really, I would say, probably advanced in terms of technology maturity, but it was a great example how they were in the low scale of maturity, and they almost leapfrogged 2 stages to get to the emerging tech stage where they're really starting to use these technologies. And it's a good lesson that as long as people have a very structured approach and a thought process to think through it, it's just not about unstructured data, it's not about just IoT, but there are many other things which mainstream enterprises can start using these technologies to get value. So with that, we run a global data and analytics survey, and the survey normally is almost like it's run in 150 countries. It covers around a sample size of, I think, 2,000 to 3,000 C-suite CEOs. And I think one of the interesting takeaways from this year's CEO surveys are, one of the things which I kind of picked out was when we really asked them, what are the real top technologies for customer engagement, right? And one of the things which clearly came out was investments in data and analytics technologies, right? Now, data and analytics technologies could be very broad, but I think the fact that somebody at that level is even identifying the category of data and analytics technologies as a key driver and I would say a growth driver for the business is a real, I think, positive. It's a positive trend to have someone as a champion at that level. And then I think we had a big decision survey which just came out today, and again we go through like 18 industries, global companies, and it's a pretty extensive survey where we really try to understand every year from senior executives what really drives your decision making, right? Is it just going by the gut, or what are the different strategies that you're going to deploy this year? And I think that one thing was probably nearly 1/3 said they're going to launch new products and services. And that's the leading big decision they're going to take. So when we talk about drivers, I think one of the key things here is many companies are trying to get into new markets. They're trying to come up with new business models. And I think this platform is going to get into a shape where it's going to enable many interesting use cases, which is going to be very strategic of nature. So I think probably in the last 3 years of working in this space and working with many clients, I see a lot of clients starting to use Hadoop a lot. But if you really look at it, there are still a lot of barriers for this platform to kind of really scale. And if you ask me, there are 4 key themes that I've seen. And if you look at enterprise, for example, we see it as an ecosystem of I would say blocks. It has capabilities. You have business functions who see it as a very heterogeneous platform in terms of how they're going to use it. A lot of organizations have problems with people and talent. And the most important thing is it's also they have a big ecosystem of legacy technologies which you cannot get rid of on day one, right? So I think we see probably a very incoherent enterprise view of what this means. So when you go and talk to like the enterprise architecture group, they have a view of the platform. You go and talk to, for example, a business unit, they would like to really have a different view of the platform. So it's very important to kind of create that holistic view across the enterprise earlier in your journey so that as you go through it in 6 or 8 months, you don't have to pivot back and redefine what this really means. The other thing which I normally get is a very overcrowded technology ecosystem. And I think that Arun said this in his keynote, probably the first HTTP distribution started with 8 components, now we have 20. There are a lot of cloud providers who have their own set of native components on the cloud. It's causing a lot of confusion in terms of what to use when. There's a lot of economics surrounding using something on the cloud or not on the cloud. So I think there's a whole layer of, I would say, rationalization and standardization which needs to happen. The third piece is the lack of user centricity. I have had a lot of clients who have spent years and years doing the back-end integration and plumbing, and it has taken them a lot of time to really build that simple abstraction layer to articulate, I would say, the key user interfaces and how, in terms of getting the data to the business to realize the real value. And that's the reason that projects like, Jupyter Notebooks and Apache Zeppelin is really interesting, because now I think the ecosystem has realized that it's not about just cooking the data in the backend, but it needs to really kind of get in the hands of users. And then the last thing which we see a lot is siloed ownership. A lot of probably, I've seen clients having multiple clusters of Hadoop, and then it also comes down to governance and leadership. So I think these are the 4 broader themes which we see enterprises struggle, and as we go in to help them, I think we kind of make sure that whatever strategies which we put in place, it kind of addresses all these 4 key points. So looking forward, what do we really see? So what's interesting about PwC is when we work with customers, we have probably a big ecosystem of capabilities and competencies within the enterprise. And we strongly believe that a lot of transformation exercises like digital, AI, any type of advanced analytics, even cybersecurity and IoT, it's going to be pretty much, I would say, it will converge in something like Enterprise Data Lake. Because as you look at each of these capabilities, it has a data component to it, and you need to make sure that the data is put in a place which is scalable, and the computing needs to happen on the platform. So when we really step back and talk to each of these stakeholders, what we realize is there is a common platform in place, and I think that the innovation in the space will really push more and more companies to adopt it, because it's no longer an option. They have to scale, and there are a lot of investments being put in each of these initiatives. So in terms of, how far we have come and what are the opportunities which exist to close the gaps, right? In the last 2 years, we have seen the growth of a lot of cloud-based marketplaces, which is good. A lot of companies who don't have good, I would say, engineering skills or don't want to spend a lot of time in building these platforms ground up, have used the cloud platform for accelerating their capabilities. We have had a lot of third-party tools, which really have innovated in this place, especially around on-demand data management and analytics. And on-demand data management is something which I view is going to disrupt how people think about enterprise data integration traditionally. And I think that we have seen like few clients starting to really use these third-party tools. And of course, there are a lot of open source libraries for AI, be it TensorFlow or anything in the Azure space. But I think in terms of the opportunities where we can close the gaps, I see a big gap in unstructured semantic analytics space where a lot of clients are asking, okay, you have the Hadoop platform. I have a lot of data which is more unstructured. I brought it in, and what should it really do to make sense of it? I know that there are a lot of open source projects, but I really think that there's not an open silver bullet or a standard to kind of really do semantic analysis. And I'm sure that probably in the next year or so, I think there's going to be more maturity there. The second piece, which we hear a lot, is a lot of companies have invested in legacy data warehouses, and some of these investments are millions in dollars. And one of the questions which often come up is, what should I do with it, right? So tomorrow, if I have to start a new project, yes, I can go and do it in Hadoop, but I have this infrastructure sitting in place, and what should I really do with it? And some of the data models which we have seen as 3,000 tables, what should I really do to manage my data models, right? So again, I think in a couple of instances where we have become kind of creative in creating our own tools and solutions, but I think that is one space which is going to be something which is needed. The third exciting space is the visualization, and I want to emphasize on this again, back to my theme of making this more, I would say, bringing it home close to the business users. In a couple of projects, we had great success in closing the gap and performance on the backend integration. But when it really came to serving up the data to the business users, what we figured out was there was not much open source options where the data was processed locally, right? So we had to use some third-party tools and connectors to go and get the data. And at that moment, there was not anything happening. So I see a wave now where the visualization layer, which has been a standalone layer, being pushed down, and you're going to have more and more innovation where the visualization can run on the cluster, right? I think that's the next wave that we are going to see with a lot of these open source projects, and it's going to be interesting to see how the third-party tools react to that. The fourth one and fifth one is, I'll touch on it. The workload management is a big issue. Like everybody knows that we want to run Hive and Spark and HBase, everything from one single place. But the practicality of that is still an experiment. So the question is, as machine learning gets embedded into data integration tools, data visualization tools, can machine learning be embedded in the workload management as a function so that as data flows through, as you have different processes running on the cluster, it can recalibrate and adapt itself so that we don't have 1,000 people operations team configuring multiple files and stuff to kind of really manage the cluster. So the takeaway is that I think we have come a long way, but there are like 4 to 5 key pieces which pretty much is critical to scaling this platform, which are gaps And the hope is hopefully the ecosystem addresses these gaps in the next probably few months or years. So in terms of clients coming to us and asking us, what should I do to jumpstart my journey, right? And we do have clients who are in different levels of maturity. Some of them already have Hadoop. Some of them have implementations which have gone wrong. And some of them pretty much have heard about it. And they ask us, where should I get started? The four core tenets that we always talk about is, number one is make sure that you look at this as an ecosystem, right? The ecosystem has multiple components, and it needs to be capability driven. And what I mean by that is, if the ecosystem has 45 components, it doesn't mean you need to use all the 45 components, and you need to make sure that you choose your priority. So you need to look at it from a capabilities point of view as a bunch of Lego blocks and not really dive deep into all of this. The second piece is this whole concept of heterogeneous stack. Gone are the days where you can go to a single vendor to pick one thing. Be prepared for the fact that this is going to be a very heterogeneous ecosystem. You're not going to get everything from one single vendor, and you need to be really prepared to work with your multiple vendors, your multiple teams to drive this to the finish. The third piece is right fit, and what we mean by that is whether it's an on-prem, hybrid, or a cloud model. I think that we see enterprises who are even moving to the cloud have issues with their legacy systems being on-prem. So we are going to see a state where probably the state data will, there are some data sets which will still live on-prem, and there'll be some computing which will move to the cloud. So the whole complexity around how are you going to really manage the integrations and the data movement from on-prem to cloud is something very important. And last but not least is the flexible operating model, and I can't emphasize enough on this piece is what we see now is when I really go and ask around the enterprise, what does it really mean for you, right? And again, as I said, you get different answers in terms of expectations from different business functions, which basically means you need to make sure that you put the right operating model in place where you engage your stakeholders by their expectations, and so that the business users get what they want out of the platform. So in terms of the capability-driven framework, we have a framework, and sometimes since this ecosystem is really growing fast and the components have increased, and people can really get confused in acronyms. So what we have come up with is basically some type of a framework which we call it as the PwC Data Lake framework, which takes 9 key components, and then we have sub-capabilities under each of these components. And we have conversations with clients from this lens, right? We never go and have a conversation with them which starts with, hey, do you need Spark, right? It's more around, why do you really need something like in-memory computing? Who are the stakeholders? What are the use cases? But I think this kind of helps to even level set the client expectations around what these components are, what are they going to do for them. And in some cases, many clients tell us that probably let me focus this year on the first 4 and not really focus on the next 5, right? So that's to the capability-driven piece. In terms of being heterogeneous, I think this is just one model, but I see more and more clients kind of using the traditional assets like enterprise data warehouse in hybrid form with Hadoop. Again, as I said, sometimes I say that it's more easier to work with clients who don't have anything, because it's easy to tell them to start doing stuff new. But if you go to larger enterprises, you might have 8 or 9 platforms, and that's a trend which we will see more and more. So we tell folks not to make assumptions like, I'm signing up for something where I'm going to get all my 80 terabytes of data from my old systems into Hadoop tomorrow, right? And I think most of the cases, we see that those kind of business cases fail after 12 months. So we kind of ask them to be more pragmatic and kind of start with the assumption that it's going to be heterogeneous. It's not going to be lift and shift. So I spoke about this a little bit in terms of the right fit. And one of the key things to really do is to have a decision model, right? And sometimes it's very easy not to really document some of the decisions being made, whether you're going to go for a cloud or an on-prem. Even in cloud, should they use infrastructure as a service or a platform as a service? And then even within that, are you going to use some of the components which are going to be used given by the cloud vendors or whatnot? So one of the things which we have started to do in all our engagements is, we call it as the right fit decision model, is to clearly document each nodes in this model and kind of put the rationale behind it to say, why was the decision taken? Did anybody consider everything in terms of technology, in terms of costs, in terms of implications? Because not having that will lead you to a conversation, for example, with your CFO in 12 months, which is, why are you asking me for $5 million for this program, right? So I think that having this decision model really helps to make those conversations much more easier. This is something, again, on the operating model is, I think we see a lot of IT organizations wanting to add Hadoop as a service to their catalog. I think that's a good sign, because if you have a centralized group which can really manage it, I think I saw the presentation yesterday at Netflix, and they were talking about how they have a 3,000 node Amazon cluster, where they really build this nice self-service portal on top of it, so that if you're working for the enterprise, you can go and really request access from them, right? But I don't think most of the enterprises are at that level of maturity, but probably at least they have that target state in mind. But I think having a business operating model is very important. If you are IT leaders, having a catalog of services which are going to be offered in Hadoop is very important. This sets the expectation for the business users to say what they can and what they cannot do. Having things like, what are you doing to onboard the user? What are the user interface tools that you're providing? What's really the use cases in terms of enabling some of these capabilities on the platform and whatnot? So that is the business operating model, but also on the technology operating model, the old question of, many companies are still grappling with, should this be a self-service or should I really control it? Because that's what I've been doing with my legacy system. So documenting it and making it very clear is important. But also in terms of what are you doing to provide training? And when I say training, it's just not for technical users, but also for business users who can go and access this platform. So building this operating model is very important, and socializing this with your business stakeholders are very important, so that as you're building these nice capabilities, you have adoption on the other side. And at the end of the day, if nobody's going to use it, there's no point in building a complex engineering system for like 10 to 12 months. So this is a 5-step approach, which we have practiced for the last, I would say, couple of years, and it has worked really well. I think that it has really worked well with companies which are small, startups, companies are medium-sized, and also large-scale enterprises, which has pockets of innovation. And the 5-step process pretty much starts with getting a good handle on the capabilities which you want to enable through this platform. And these capabilities could be seen from the lens of business units, or it could be seen from the lens of business function, or these could be seen from the lens of your stakeholders. Because, I've seen a couple of examples where, for example, a marketing group can have like 4 subgroups or something, right? So that's possible. So it starts with the capabilities, and then the use case specifications actually flows from the capabilities, because I think the way I see it is, if you have 75 capabilities identified, each of your use case should pretty much map to what are the capabilities is the use case bringing to life, right? So, I mean, having that use case nailed is important, of course. And then the platform architecture and operating model. And when we build future state architectures, we always tell clients that make sure you build transition states. And without transition states, just having a picture is not very useful. And the transition states are useful because of the fact that you show all of those components as Lego blocks, and then you light them up based on what do you think would be the speed of execution for your enterprise. So an enterprise can basically say, I'm going to use, I don't know, just establish Hive or Spark as my priority this year. I don't want to use HBase, for example, right? So I think that the transition states in your platform architecture is important. And then the fourth is pretty much an architecture pattern, right? And what I'm really excited about yesterday when I learned about the whole concept of Hortonworks providing these components and having people assemble it, I think that's something which is great because it's gonna accelerate adoption. Because the biggest problem now is, as I build my use case, there's a lot of confusion in terms of what components should I assemble to orchestrate the use case, what are the benchmarking parameters and stuff like that. So the architecture patterns kind of flow out of that. And then last but not least, it's pretty much a roadmap which clearly explains how these use cases, your governance and operating model is really going to be implemented over a period of, I would say, 18 months or 36 months. So these are the 5 things, and I think that we have done projects based on the scope, probably as little as anything from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, but these 5 tenets have really worked well. So I want to end it with 2 use cases, because at the end of the day, I think that this is a good demonstration of what customers have done. So in the first use case, we were working with the financial service provider, and I think what they really had was an Oracle database. They pretty much had gathered a lot of historical data for 15 years, and they were pretty much using basic SAS for doing transformation, and then the SAS process fed a lot of reporting, but also they had a risk modeling team of 60 to 70 people who did a lot of financial risk modeling. And when we went and saw this, I would say current state, the temptation would have been to basically say, hey, take all of your data and put it in a faster appliance and do things faster. So what we really thought was, how can we really set them up for long-term success? So in this case, what we did was that the client actually did not have any technologies which were even close to Hadoop or anything emerging tech. We did use the Hortonworks distribution running on Amazon EC2. And then we made sure that their hyper-normalized model, which is running in Oracle, we denormalized it as much as possible to a level, but we kept the transactions very flat. We used Hive and Spark, and I think for people who are used to the traditional nomenclature, we pretty much use Hive to partition and land the data, and used Hive as a temp table and Spark as a pipeline to move data between different Hive objects. And then we were able to persist 5 years worth of data as a Spark RDD object with 30 key attributes. And we were able to integrate that with Tableau. And as a result, a simple example was we had people who wanted to do historical analysis of 5 years worth of data, and they were able to do it in one dashboard on demand. And I think for this enterprise, it was something which was very transformational, because it's not like they didn't have the data. They had data for the last 14, 15 years, but bringing it on demand and on the same screen to do some trend analysis was very difficult. We encountered a lot of issues with Spark in terms of tuning or whatnot, but I think that's something which we have worked on in the last 4 to 5 months. And that is a simple example of a financial service provider which is trying to do basic things with their core business data to enable some reporting capabilities. Also, we had some analytics risk modelers, and the risk modelers were working with, I think, probably 30 to 40 variables for doing their models. And every week, they would come back to IT and say, I need to add 3 more or 4 more variables or attributes. And it was a painful process for them to go all the way back, change all the ETL workflows, and then pretty much come back to them and say, hey, this project's going to take like 6 months to finish. And by that time, their models were anyway outdated, right? So in this case, what we also did was we used architecture where a lot of the backend ETL process was done in Hive. But as we moved down up the chain, we used more and more Spark. And we used a couple of adaptive data prep tools where we can come in and do updates very quickly, so that if a modeler came in at 6 p.m. and said, hey, I want to add like 9 variables, we could use something to update the Spark RDD on the fly. So this is a simple use case for the financial service provider, which was done with Hive Spark, running on Amazon, but it also adds some adaptive data prep tools to address the dynamic requests which came in from the users. The second use case was for a CPG company. And again, as you know, retail and consumer and CPG companies, they operate in low margins. They pretty much are very, I would say, not big spenders of technology platforms. And in this case, again, we had a very, I would say, legacy and traditional infrastructure, which was running on relational database systems. And they really wanted to transform their process where they wanted to use AWS S3 to really dump all of the transactions, and then use Spark to do the ETL process, and then do visualizations on Spark. So this project was something where we took almost like 500,000 SKUs they had. They have around 250,000 customers. There were some suppliers and fleets. And if you really add and multiply all these combinations, you clearly end up with billions of transactions. But we were able to take that data, put it on AWS, and kind of really show them that you can do Spark to do basic aggregations and group buys. But also, once you do it, you can store it back and then use it for either reporting or do analytical modeling. So in terms of what PwC is at, I think that what's interesting now I see within our firm is, since we are into 3 domains, I see data and analytics being embedded in each of the domains. What's interesting is even the tax function has been starting to think, how should I really transform some of the things which I'm doing with tax data? And as a chief technologist, it's really interesting for me to kind of see the broad spectrum of practitioners within my company who focus on very different domains, thinking about similar data problems. And for us, this platform is going to be really be critical as we kind of go and do some type of market awareness, but also we build platforms for ourselves to solve key critical issues. We do a lot of thought leadership in this area. We have strategic alliances with all the cloud vendors, also with Hortonworks and all the other folks. And then and we have invested in building a lot of analytical apps over the last 2-3 years. And these apps, which are around 200 of them, they focus on a sector, they focus on a business problem, and we have been trying to make those apps run on scalable platforms like Hadoop and the cloud, so that it can be cloud ready, it can be scalable, and the business models are more changing to be more platform centric. So in terms of the closing thoughts, I think the 5 things which I will kind of leave you all with is, number 1 is we definitely believe that all the external market forces, be it any transformation programs within the enterprise or anything which is happening on the consumer space, will force companies to look at data lake as an option. And in many cases, the adoption might be slow, but people will be forced to look at it and use it. We acknowledge the fact that there are still barriers in mainstream enterprises, but we always tell clients let that not be a I would say, a key point in you not really experimenting and learning and using the platform. And I think the biggest opportunity is how are we going to abstract a lot of complexity in this platform to a lot of simple user experiences, which are important. And then I think the 4 core tenets of being capability driven, acknowledging the fact it's going to be a heterogeneous ecosystem, making sure that you have the right due diligence to make sure you have the right fit and a good operating model are key. And then we spoke about the 5 steps, which is very critical for execution. And with that, I would just say thanks for attending the session. I have some thought leadership materials. If you're interested, you could grab it from this desk. So, great. Thank you. Sorry.